Well, here we are moving into part 3 of the class. Now, the first 2 parts of the course focused more on more traditional ways of developing and implementing assessments. And if you recall, what we mean by assessments in this class are formal attempts to measure educational variables of interest. And those formal attempts that were addressed in parts 1 and 2, they focused on traditional types of assessments, and that is selected response types of items, things like multiple choice or true and false or matching, and then also some constructed response items, mostly focusing on short answer and perhaps essay. Again, those types of assessment items focus on the way that students would communicate to you about something just using words usually. So definitely a limiting way to assess. And it reminded me as we move into part 3 that at the very beginning of the class, I had a student contact me and ask me, after reviewing the material for the course, ask me if we were going to be focusing at all on alternative assessments. And I did mention to the student at the time that we would be moving into less traditional ways of assessing, but I said the focus was going to be on performance assessments. And so as we move into part 3, I wanted to sort of elaborate a little bit on what performance assessments are and how they relate to alternative assessments. Because the reality is what you're going to be learning how to do in part 3 of the class actually does sort of underscore best practices for designing alternative assessments, or as some people refer to them as authentic assessments. And again, some people just refer to all of them as performance assessments. But best practices related to that, and you could apply these skills to lots of different types of kind of formal assessments that are non-traditional in nature. So some of the common ways that people typically might assess learners outside the approach for traditional assessment types could be just making organized observations of students. And that might involve perhaps developing checklists or overall notes or comments on student behavior. Again, we're talking about assessments now, and so it's a formal way to do that, as opposed to just informally observing student responses or actions and making some judgments about educational variables of interest related to that. But observations are one. Essays are another common way to observe student performances. Interviews, you can interview students in formal ways and obtain valuable data regarding what they've learned how to do. Performance tasks, like the kind that we're going to be focusing on in part 3 of the class, is certainly an alternative assessment. Demonstrations that the students do, or exhibitions. Creating portfolios of work or evidence that students can apply things that they're learning. Journals, rubrics, which can go along with any of those, and that's going to be one emphasis in part 3 of the class, is how a rubric can be used for students and educators to self-assess, as well as to assess students on complicated tasks. And that relates to another form of alternative assessment, and that would be self or peer evaluation, using some formal guide that's developed by the teachers. So that's going to be the emphasis of part 3 for the class. And I'll just say that that a couple good examples of all the kind of the need for an alternative assessment would relate to a rather sort of important outcome these days. And I'll just talk about a couple. Okay, so one of them might be, let's say that you're a teacher and one of your important educational variables of interest is helping your students learn how to determine the credibility of online news reports. Okay, so the credibility of online news reports. Now, if that was the broad kind of thing that you wanted students to learn about, as educators, the first thing you'd want to do is to identify specifically what skills you want them to learn how to do in order to be able to sort of determine credibility. And one thing, for example, is that you might have a sub-objective that says that the students would be able to identify the characteristics of a credible news source, for example, a credible news source. Now, identifying the characteristics of a credible news source could be measured kind of accurately in a number of ways. That's an outcome that might very well lend itself to more traditional types of kind of assessment item type. You could do multiple choice. You could ask students which of the following are characteristics of a credible news source, and they have to identify all that apply. That would be reasonable. It could be that you would want to provide students with an online news source and ask them to assess or identify or determine the credibility of a source, and not a whole story, but one source. Now, in that case, the objective that you would have as a teacher would be, given an example of an online news source, students would be able to determine or at least identify characteristics that of it that relate to its credibility or something like that. You'd want to be very precise, because if you think about it, if you want a student to be able to at least identify the characteristics of credibility for a provided news source, then what would you be looking for as a teacher? And that would fold into what your outcome is. So there are some things that would be easy and in many cases appropriate to measure using more traditional types of items. But if you were going to provide students with an online news story and you wanted them to determine the credibility of that news story, then how are they going to communicate that the results of that in the best way possible that help you know that they know how to do that they can do that? And being able to identify the credibility of an entire story would require that there were news sources that would have to be identified, and those would have to be assessed and evaluated. And so you might want the students to select a news story, or you provide them with one, and then you'd want them to communicate to you, first of all, what are the news sources that were used that are the basis of that story, and then what are the characteristics of those news sources that communicate credibility or not, and then collectively, how do those add up to the overall credibility of a news story? And you might want them to communicate about the potential bias of the people who are writing the news story, or something like that too. But my point is that there could be a host of specific things that you would want students to include in a critique that the students use to help them determine the credibility of a news story, and so you'd want to communicate what those are to the students, teach them about them, obviously, and then assess them on their ability to do that. And it might be a checklist, it might be a rubric, it might be a more traditional type of series of examples and then questions about the examples that could be more multiple choice or maybe short answer, something like that. You could do that. It may or may not align specifically with the outcomes. You might have some content validity issues with that. But definitely the most appropriate way, I think, to measure an outcome of that nature would be using something that was more alternative, more performance-based. So that's why it's important to learn a little more about these types or the methods for alternative assessment. And again, we won't really be getting into sort of a comprehensive look at different types, but you'll be looking at the kind of the underlying mechanisms for being able to assess. And I'll just say one more thing about another common way to assess in an alternate way, and that would be, let's say that you were an art teacher or a PE teacher, or you were teaching physical education skills or art-related skills, and you wanted your learners to ultimately to appreciate something, appreciate Impressionist art, or appreciate the value of daily exercise. So appreciate is an interesting word because once you unpack appreciate, what you realize is, first of all, you can't appreciate something unless you know about it and understand it at some level. And again, understand is a pretty fuzzy word, not a good word to use in an objective. So you'd want to operationalize what you might mean by understand. But once you know about something or understand something, then appreciating it means that you value it, and to value it could be translated into making choices about it. So obviously, in the case of the physical education example, the most obvious way to measure whether or not a learner appreciates the value of daily physical education is whether or not they choose daily physical education. And how do you measure that? How do you measure that somebody makes a choice to view Impressionist art? Or they make a choice about Impressionist art that's favorable? You could ask learners to keep a log of their activity associated with physical exercise for the PE outcome. As far as visual art goes, you could give students a survey. You can ask them whether like present different types of visual art and ask students to rate how they feel with different item types. You could even do that with physical education. You could ask students in a survey, how many times a week do you, outside of school, do you spend in physical activity for more than, a certain amount of time. So surveys are also important ways that you can formally measure outcomes that are sort of in less traditional ways, and perhaps even measuring outcomes that don't always get measured. So there's going to be a little bit about that in some of the readings that you're going to have. There's going to be information about portfolios that you're going to be presented with, and that type of assessment, and also how you might use something like a rubric, how you might design it and then use it in an effective way to not only measure but also quantify, that is, turn into numbers, an overall score for a particular type of performance. So that's what part 3 is going to be all about, and you have a project in which you're going to actually develop a rubric for a performance that you describe. So there's going to be a little bit more creativity in this project than there were in some of the previous ones as we move into this type of assessment. So hope you enjoy part 3. And as always, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns as you move through this part of the class.